Hello everyone and welcome to Climate Australia. I am your host, Lee Constable, and today we'll be talking to the hosts of a podcast you all need to listen to. We'll be talking to Jess and Ash from HEAPS BETTER. So I'll just add myself to the stream now because I'm going to start the way that we always do here at Climate Australia, which is acknowledging country. I want to acknowledge where I am today. I am on the land of the Turrbal and Yugara people, so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also pay my respects to Indigenous people who may be watching not just across the many First Nations that make up Australia, or what we now call Australia, but across the world. Thank you so much for joining me. I just want to acknowledge that the Turrbal and Yugara people have an ongoing relationship with storytelling, with land, sea and sky, with the environment, with justice and sustainability, and all of those things, and definitely storytelling, are going to be a part of what we're talking about today. So without further ado, I will introduce my guests. I've got Jessica Hamilton joining me, and I'll just add you to the stream. Hi.
Hello.
And we've got Ash Davies joining me. Sorry, I always butcher your name because I convinced myself it said one way and then the other way in my mind.
Good enough.
Thank you so much for joining me here today, and
thanks for having us.
Let everyone know a little bit about who Jess and Ash are.
Ash, we're broadcasting. Yeah, we're broadcasting from different places. Even though we worked on a podcast, a lot of it was done by distance. So I'm here on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, still unceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And Jess is up in the Snowy Mountains. So
yeah, I'm in New South Wales Snowy Mountains, so the land of the Narragoo people, and likewise, as you so beautifully put it, Lee and Ash, to pay my respects to any First Nations people listening across this many countries that we're all joining in today. Thank you very much for having us, Lee.
And it is such a mark of the year that has been. This is actually my final broadcast for Climate Australia for the year. I'll be back next year. So basically what I wanted to do was talk about what your podcast is, and the last episode's just gone out there, but I also wanted to talk about what's happening as far as the climate conversation this year. And it's such a mark of the times that we're talking about this, but also that we're talking about this remotely and that you produce this remotely. So we'll start at the start. How did you come to create a podcast together in the first place? And how did you come to choose this topic?
It's interesting talking about it as this year because 2020 was, this podcast came right at the start of 2020 as an idea for Ash and I when we were in Sydney together. It was just before what I think it was the biggest climate rally that Sydney had, and in the middle of the bushfire smoke, and Ash and I met in a cafe, just sort of in the middle of our crippling climate anxiety that a lot of us and our friends were all experiencing, and our country at the time of those bushfires in January. And I had seen Ash, we've known each other for years. We worked together at FBI Radio years and years and years ago. And I noticed Ash post on her Facebook a bit of a yell into the
void. Like real panic posting stuff. But also like the idea that we bonded over so quickly, and like how that turned into a podcast was I was like, okay, so we don't know what we're doing. Like the government's not doing enough, so we're going to have to do stuff. Therefore, we need to make a spreadsheet of everything that we can do for the climate. And then because everyone's got different, capacities and abilities and different kinds of like amounts of time and money, we need to have everything in a column, right? So like, how long things take, and how much they might cost you. And then you can kind of try to quantify the impact individually, but quantify the impact in terms of like when you get to a certain tipping point, and then look at those things and be like, ooh, strategically, what should individuals be doing? Because we're all just kind of like panicking and giving more like money to like the same kind of like charity things that were going around at the time, and just so desperate to do something. So we were like, okay, spreadsheet, maybe not the most compelling idea.
I love that that's where your mind went though.
It was
like, that shows a strategic mind.
I can't even do it.
And I, meanwhile, had a really good friend of mine was pregnant during the bushfires down in Victoria and was in a really, really dark space with her anxiety. And so a couple of friends in Vic and I got together to be like, all right, well, let's just do one practical thing each week. Like week 1 can be finances, week 2 can be our home power, and we'll just kind of get through it together. And but it was a bit hard to do that in Victoria. So Ash wrote me into her spreadsheet and I wrote her into my weekly topic thing. And that's where it sort of kind of turned into a podcast, strangely.
Yeah, that's so cool, because, I mean, we have a lot of people like me who come from, like, I've been thinking about and talking about climate for a long time, but in some ways that works against me, because sometimes I take for granted what people might think, what people might be into, what people might know, what people might already do and care about. So in that way, you both have an advantage in a way. Did you realize that at first when you went to make the podcast?
I think
what we really went dark. So what was the beginning of that question? What's our head start?
Did we
I was
realize
just saying you had a head start compared to someone like me who's been talking about climate change for so long.
Yeah, so the enthusiasm can be maybe hard to, like the newness factor. The enthusiasm for ideas can probably be a bit harder to come by, and like maybe the burnout's real. I don't know for you, Lee, but do you kind of find that you kind of burn out on the topic? And
I burn out and I fire up.
You got to fire up to burn out. You just got to leave yourself on for too long.
Yeah, I think honestly, it's seeing people like you make these podcasts, and people come out of the woodwork in lots of different spaces and different sectors to kind of fill their own gaps in the conversation. So what was your backgrounds? Jess, we'll start with you. Like, what was your background that you brought to this? Because there's the things you don't know, but you knew a lot of stuff that you brought to this.
My background is sort of half in podcasting. I work with an agency called Audiocraft in Australia, who do a lot of really interesting podcasting work. But I also have been working with an agency called Love Frankie for the last few years, which is an APAC-based social change agency that mostly works with counter radicalization and racism in online spaces. So they do a lot of, with them I've been really lucky to work on a lot of really interesting communication-based events or campaigns or video sort of productions that has, I mean, so much of it kind of ties in with this when you're looking at these big systemic things and trying to engage everyday people and in online spaces, and 2020 was so online. A lot of that work kind of ties in with, I suppose, with what we're facing with climate change, when it is this multifaceted global systemic problem, and it is something that every everyday person, no matter who you are, you can choose to tap out if it's overwhelming, but you ultimately, it's here for all of us, and it's part of our normal lives. So going about addressing it or getting involved in it in what feels natural to our normal lives was something that was really interesting, or like something that I really wanted and was interesting, I guess, to be thinking about as well.
Yeah, and I suppose you both started to notice that the type of thing that you wanted to hear just wasn't there.
Totally.
And so you were like, you know what? Why don't we create the content we want to listen to in the world?
Basically, that was like almost exactly the pitch. It's like, okay, it's the podcast that we want, and what we wanted and we weren't hearing was something that was kind of, it gave you enough of an understanding of what's happening, and not in a way that's like limited. Let's talk about climate change exclusively. We kind of want to understand how systems work together and where power might be sitting, and like what, if we have a more rounded understanding of what's going on, not only is it more interesting and you feel like you're more equipped to deal with things, then, on top of actually kind of cultivating the understanding and having a good time, and like we're like, maybe the difference with Heaps Better is that as much as we know some stuff, we're also happy with being, I guess, helpful idiots, as in we're happy with like not knowing everything and being the people who learn alongside you rather than teach at you. Mm-hmm. Or, sort of like speak in really jargonistic terms. So it's like we weren't hearing that. And then the ultimate thing for both of us was that we were watching all of this media and absorbing all this news, and it was like, here's this really important thing, and then it gets to the end and it's like the end, and you're like, but what do I do about it? How do I how do I, now that I'm informed, I would like to be able to do something. And that was just frequently not, like, it was just not an option. And then you just go away feeling really helpless about it. And there's this whole like learned helplessness when it comes to climate change of like confronting it once, twice, 3 times. It's a source of stress. We're encountering it all the time. And so you actually learn how helpless you are if you don't get to do something about like changing the situation that is stressing you out.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, it's definitely something I thought about in, you know, starting Climate Australia and doing this live stream show was, yes, we're going to talk about problems, but we need to also talk about what does this mean that we need to do? What needs to happen? Whether it's me as an individual or something out of my control, I think it's important to have that conversation. We've got Mark Spencer on Simpatico TV chat saying, I am pumped. Just finished the last episode of the mini-series, which is exciting. It is out right now. Let's do a little like mid-live stream plug. You will get more plug opportunities, but let's do a little plug if people want to have a look.
Plug.
I will get you to do a call out at the end with what the website is, but for now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play you all a little trailer, or actually a little like example of what this podcast is. So we'll listen to a comment that I think goes to something else that Climactive had just said, which is we have so much climate communications about problems, but this approach from the personal, then scaling up to the air horn systemic change. I love that. Bow, 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 bow. I think that's what I mean.
It's exciting
systemic
stuff.
Change. It was an inspired approach. Great to hear that from Climactic, which of course are a whole network of podcasters, like Game Recognized Game, I suppose. There are also podcasters out there talking about the climate change. All right, so here's a little clip.
We know in our hearts that just changing our consumer behaviour isn't going to be enough. Introducing systemic change.
Well, so systemic change means that rather than a proportion of the population have just changed their consumption habits in the next 10 years, that Australia has shifted all of its electricity generation in the next 10 years to clean energy, something that multiple studies have now said that we can do relatively easily.
So there you go. That was a clip. Do you want to tell people about that conversation and how you first came across that perspective?
Well, like
That was a real big moment in 2020 for us. Tears were in the eyes.
Ash, when you were saying like, and your question earlier, Lee, or your comment about us kind of not being on the inside of this industry as environmentalists or working within the environmental climate change sort of industry or spaces and coming to it from our own space, is that we were like, yeah, there's these big concepts like Ash was saying before that we wanted to explore and look at, like collective action and systemic change, but it can risk being a bit jargon and like alienating if you're not in it. And so totally. I think that's one of the funnest things was for Ash and I, we were like we actually went to Greenpeace and like, okay, cool, we want to make this podcast, like, you know, we've got all these actions that we want to do and we'll do cycling to the shops one day, and they were like, no.
Oh, honey, no.
Stop. Well, actually, legitimately along the way, and then we were like, all right, so we actually learned so much along the way of making it, but then we're like sitting down with each episode being like, how can we tell this in a story that is fun and sticks for us, that isn't like the kind of by the book language and, you know, like turning systemic change into Goldilocks, or Ash coming up with this like story of divestment that's like cutting down the beanstalk of the giant and like this ridiculous booth running around, but it's like it sticks, and it's obviously for some people going to be a bit bizarre, but for people like us, we're like, all right, this is how we can engage with these things that typically, like things like finance and divestment, you'd be like, oh, that's not for me, that's for an expert to deal with.
Totally. And how can we make it entertaining and engaging and you know, fast paced enough while also actually adhering to some essential theory of change or like overall strategic plan. And, you know, a lot of what Jess and I were talking about early on is that, like, you know, I think a lot of our friends are really keen to take climate action, but then they get bombarded with all of these things that are more sustainable or better or whatever, but they just don't know what the best thing is to do. And I think the kind of overwhelm and the amount of decisions that you have to make in order to even get to the point where you do take action, because you have to pick an action, that can actually just, you know, you lose people along the way.
Yes.
just like the stress level goes up, the more decisions you have to make, and then people, myself included, are just shut down. And so, you know, we wanted to make sure that the podcast sort of followed a sensible kind of like line of thought and an actual strategy from one of the most strategic organizations in the world, Greenpeace. And so, you know, what's the best thing for Australia to do? Where can we have the most impact? What does that look like at the individual level? And what will this look like when we all do it together? Because we're heaps better together. Yeah.
Oh, yes, heaps better. The air horn. Actually, Mike on the Simpatico TV chat said the air horn is my fave. He also says, I'm joining from Ramaytush Alone land, which is in the States. Welcome, Jess and Ash. Great to have you here, Mike. Give us a shout out whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, and Simpatico TV. Let us know what you're up to, where you are. If you know the First Nations people, let us know whose land you're on. If you don't know, great opportunity to find out. This is Ash and Jess, who have just been talking us through Heaps Better, the podcast that is out right now that you can all listen to, that is supported by Greenpeace Australia. Shout out to them because, as well, we're streaming on their socials right now. Hi! Tell everyone where they can watch this. I mean, listen to this. Sorry.
Everywhere. So if there's a podcast app, we're on it now. And then if you just go to greenpeace.org.au/heaps better, it's a great place to go because you can listen to all of the all of the episodes there, but you can also browse all of the guides for getting things done. So it's kind of like your one-stop shop. It's a really great website.
It is. It's really pretty as well. We've actually used some of the branding around here. The orange and the Heaps Better logo is there. I wore this shirt just to try and fit in with the branding a little bit because it's fun.
It's so good.
It looks fun. So at the moment, I haven't made my way through the full series yet. Ooh, I've started listening to it, knowing that I would have spoilers today. But even before, when someone first sent me this, and shout out to Mark, thank you for sending me this, I looked at the website and I was like, oh my God, I'm already having fun here. You know, what sort of conversations were you both having? Because, you know, you had the spreadsheet and then you went to like, do we do this? Do we do that? Hey, Greenpeace Australia, what about recycling? They're like, honey, let's talk about systemic change. And like, how did you kind of, I mean, obviously you're both very charismatic people and it's like, it's clear that you want to listen to you as soon as you start that first episode, but it's even clear before that. Like, how did you come to talk about the tone and the vibe? Were you taking inspiration from somewhere else?
Oh, that's such a good question. Jess, does anything pop into your mind there?
I think the biggest thing was just that we wanted to listen to something and couldn't find, around climate change, couldn't find what we'd wanted to listen to. It's like there's so much out there, and particularly in January around the bushfires, there was just I think everyone was stuck in that 24-hour, you know, checking the bushfire app and checking the news, and there was so much that was about like, there's a lot of heavy stuff. There was a lot of grief and a lot of anxiety, and we sort of made a decision like that for us felt a bit crippling, and for the friends that we wanted to be bringing along with us, and like my friend who I mentioned was pregnant and really unable to even kind of talk about any of it. It was sort of like the people who can't watch David Attenborough docos, which is me. Like I struggled to watch David Attenborough's last documentary because I was like, I just know what it's going to do to my little old heart. So we were sort of straight up said about like, you know, there's enough of that type of content out there, but for Ash and I as people and friends and the way that we go about our daily lives, we needed to have a bit more like kind of action and laughs and do it in our own, and things that were like deliberately kind of putting aside anything. It obviously was serious and something we wanted to take very seriously. In that first episode with David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, when he says this beautiful story about his parents going through war and saying like, you know, we need to balance grief and belief, but we ultimately wanted to be addressing that, but leaning heavily into belief and action, open optimism, and there's plenty of other spaces where the other side of things has been and is being explored. So that was quite a deliberate choice for us.
Yeah, and I feel like you know, the whole thing like the real driving thing is that we wanted action to actually happen. And I think that like the pathway to action, you can put a lot of obstacles on it, and like dealing with difficult things, or like not making it make sense, or including jargon and all of that stuff. We kind of we had a list of things that like heaps better is and heaps better isn't, because I think what you aren't is important when it comes to talking about climate, because I think it can't all be, it's not all the same audience, because it's the entire world who's going through this. So we had to figure out, our audience, and then what our audience needs, and then what we can actually bring to the table. So we weren't about to put on our suits and pretend that we were like the most serious people in the room. So we knew that people wanted like solutions. They wanted a solutions-focused podcast rather than a problems-focused podcast. And then, we wanted it to be about collective action rather than about kind of conscious consumerism. And, we wanted to really lean heavily on the positive vision for the future rather than the negative vision for the future that we must avoid, because I think everyone's got that, but they don't actually know what a positive future might look like. And we have such a very clear, attainable, awesome, like potential positive future for Australia. Even, when we're talking about the podcast broadly, like we're really looking at changing the energy system a lot. So, the potential there is great. It's actually a happy story if we take it on, and if enough people know about it and enough people know what to ask for. So being positive with this podcast was kind of, it was natural almost, because as long as we keep that like vision front of mind, then, people can look for more opportunities to get closer to that vision of the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. The discussion around hope and positivity is really interesting, because I've seen different kinds of those things. I've seen some people that I've talked to about climate change just conversationally just be like, yeah, but I think it'll be fine. And then I've talked to other people where their positivity has really been like, no, the best thing is there's so much we can do, and it's energizing and empowering for them. And then I've seen negativity and anger being used in really active and empowering ways. Like I know some of our biggest figures have said, I'm sick of pretending everything's fine, it's not, and that's been energizing. And then other people have been so negative, they're like, oh, we've already ruined it, and so never mind. How do you kind of walk that line?
Well, first of all, don't record a podcast when you're in a terrible mood.
Yes. Totally.
I think the anger thing's interesting in this 4th episode, which is about how we can, there's so many Australians say that we want to do something about climate change, but our last election rolled around and the voting numbers didn't really say that, show that we wanted climate action. And a lot of people, I think, sit back, us included at times, and we'll go, I don't quite know how to get engaged in that political conversation, or I don't know if there's any point writing to a politician like that. So the 4th episode's about trying to figure out if and how we can get out of that like stage fright, and talking to the people with power. And we had 2 conversations, one with Rebecca Huntley, where she was like, anger is really important, but use it like chili, like use it like a kick, and don't kind of blast people with this like her words were, dear Mr. Bastard MP, and like send an angry email, because it just won't get read, but to keep that anger and use it as a kick. And then Annie Leonard, who was so amazing, who's the director of Greenpeace USA, and she at one moment was like, which I don't think made it into the podcast in the end, but she was like, we've just made a mistake of being too polite. And so it was like, not to be aggressive, but to channel anger, and not to just sit back and be expecting things to happen. And that actually like the cool thing was to just sit back and let things unfold as business as usual.
Or being like, oh, well, if we give them like this documentary or like more kind of bits of graphs and research, then like it's totally clear that people will act when they get this information, because we know what this information means. And it's just actually digesting information and understanding it and acting on it is not the business of politicians, unfortunately.
Or everyday humans.
Or everyday humans, no. We're much more driven by emotion and immediate.
It's the most frustrating thing, isn't it? Because when I did my master's in science communication, like after figuring out that I wasn't going to be an environmental scientist like I originally thought I was, because that wasn't where the solutions were, or the problem necessarily. And one of the most difficult facts for me to grapple was, ironically, the fact that people don't listen to facts to change their minds.
Yeah,
totally.
It's a vicious cycle, I tell you. But
Totally.
it is important to recognise, and if anyone's watching and you're a climate communicator, whether you do it in the media, like the three of us here, whether that's traditional media or other types of media on social media, or whether you do it climate communication at a barbecue or with chatting to your friends, it is an important thing to think about. Using those emotions that we feel in ways that are constructive and not destructive, and thinking about what does and doesn't change people's minds, and whether even you're spending too much energy trying to change minds. I've had a few people ask me about this channel and who the audience are, and I think climate concerned, climate curious people, as well as climate professionals themselves, are the audience. Who are your audience? Are you thinking that some people might be deniers and listen, or are you just like, you know what, if so, great, but they're not our major audience?
I think that deniers are overwhelmingly like people who deny factual information that's it's agreed upon by 99+% of scientists. I don't think that they're in our target audience, and I don't think that they listen to people like us, partly because we're young women, but also because I think that they might be a little bit hard to reach just in general with information, and they might not actually be listening to podcasts. That might be the kind of level of information diet they're on. They might be listening to like maybe radio instead. So
different podcasts.
So yeah, exactly. So I don't think we're looking to communicate with deniers. It was almost exclusively people who, and this is like the majority of Australians until you start getting into the more specific demographics like age and stuff like that. But people who are live in Australia and they think that climate change is a massive issue that we should be doing something about. And that's like based on, there was this ethics report not so long ago, and it was like 90% of Australians think that climate change is happening, that we should do something about it, and they think so much so that the federal government should be mobilizing funds in like a really meaningful way. Like they don't care if we as a country lose money, if the budget takes a hit because we're doing things about climate change, so that's 90%, which is like those are pretty good numbers. So we're talking to those people, but then also younger people.
I think also like where it's not new stuff for a lot of people too. So there was a sort of this secondary thing of like it's in part people who care and are engaged, but are maybe overwhelmed, confused of what to do, and like wanting to do something, but there's just so much info out there. If you try Googling it yourself, it's overwhelming. So partly that, and also their friends who maybe are like slightly less engaged, to give them talking points when you're at that barbecue or at the school yard or whatever. And like Ash and I are with those people too, and we're learning, like through this podcast, we were learning so much of it. And so there's still so much that we have to learn. We sound like idiots sometimes, and we're happy to. And we genuinely did learn so much through it. And I think, and still have so much to learn. So that was another really important thing, was that we're not like talking down to people and telling you what to do. We're sort of like, well, we've got to walk the talk and actually do this stuff and figure it out, and like figure out how you go about doing it, not sort of be like, yeah, you should
totally like it's horizontal. Like, when you listen to the podcast, you're not just a listener or an audience member, you're a heaps better friend forever, because like, I think, if you're gonna be a good person, just taking care of the planet is like a really great place to start, to be like a good mate with people. And I think that like ultimately, I think that while climate change is going to wreak a lot of havoc, I think that socially, if we can get this right, and if we can ally ourselves with people who want to make small worlds or the big world a better place, then we're going to have, I guess, it's going to be I don't know, I feel like a bit of a renaissance of kind of like community, because we are going to have to deal with this as a community. And so I don't think that we should just be kind of talking down to people and like sending out official broadcasts about climate. Like we need that groundswell and that kind of like lots of those communities, and a lot of them already exist, but a podcast is one of the easiest ones to sort of like feel like you're tapping into, because it's just, I know that when I listen to a podcast, I'm just like, oh, so these are my friends. Like my brain doesn't know that they don't know about me.
It's super great to be best friends with all these famous people. How wonderful.
Totally. It's great. Like all of my friends are like intellectuals. It's incredible. So creative. It's like they're all in podcasts.
Yeah,
they don't
like
exist. They're all
I was saying to Jane Goodall the other day.
Yeah, totally.
But actually just Felipe on Facebook has sent a couple of these emojis and a green love heart. Obviously feeling pumped from watching. Mike is asking a question on Simpatico TV chat. Lots of people my age and younger, he's a millennial, are quite outraged by the lack of climate action, and we're often told to vote, which here in the US, historic numbers of us young folks did. It seems like my generation is no longer content to sit back and let things unfold, yet we're sort of told that a lot of the solutions are up to us. Yet we hold so little of the legislative power here. How much, this is a big one, how do we solve that other than through the passage of time? Yeah, it's a big one. And more importantly, how can we communicate the message to older generations, which in politics frequently do unfortunately label us as complainers? It seems like the message is hitting younger folks and we hear it. And when it comes to legislative power, we're in a very disadvantageous spot. My gosh, Mark, that is something on a lot of our minds. What do you say to Mike?
Mike. I mean, like, I think that when it comes to the older people thing, I'm actually really interested in that, because it's like, think about in Australia, who's going to have the most superannuation, and changing where you're invested can really shift the landscape, and capital flight, you know, when people leave certain investment options because they're bad for the climate, you know, it sends a signal. It sends a really strong signal. But the thing is, like, the people with the most capital amassed are often the oldest people. Not always, but, you know, so it would be great if we could get them on board. But I've noticed that the way that people attack that is less to do with, like, you should care about climate change because this, that, and the other. It starts with figuring out what they're actually interested in them. And you could find that the answer is that they're really only interested in money. And that might be the way that you have to attack that problem, you know? So, like, I know a mate of mine is a climate scientist, and his mum doesn't believe in climate change, which is, like, clearly quite fraught. It's like, when are you having children? It's like, mum, no. So he made her, because she's a businesswoman, he made her a solar kind of calculation, and then showed her the price reason, like the kind of cost benefit analysis of why you should go solar. So you can get people involved in solutions without getting them fully invested and believing in the reason that we need these solutions. They don't need to have like a full understanding. And for some people, a full understanding is not reachable, like now in this time in their lives. But what are the solutions that would make the biggest difference for them? And how can you find, like, an advantageous pathway in? And maybe how can you, like, soften the way in there? But, like, when it comes to legislation, I feel like I'm the least equipped to even commentate on that. And I even, like, worked in politics for a bit, and I'm still just like, for young people, I mean, what you can do is start a party.
Yeah, the cool thing is that, I mean, I wouldn't have known this if I didn't go to a university where everyone studies law. I'm realizing how there are so many more and more millennial lawyers nowadays.
Yeah.
As well as millennials working in government in these different positions. It's
going to change. It'll shift.
Yeah, and it is heartening to hear some of the stats, at least here in Australia, around the number of people who actually care about climate change and think it's important, because I find that really gets me excited, because I'm like, you know what? this is awesome. I don't even
Yeah.
need to hit my head against a brick wall trying to convince people to worry about it. I can move on to the next and even more important thing of like talking about what to do. How cool
Exactly.
is that?
Yeah, totally. You can't just be like, well, everyone's worried about it. My job here is done. Like the real work is actually turning worry into action. And so when it comes to like legislation and stuff like that, you know, we're often kind of like encouraged by the fact that everyone seems to care. We need to actually be putting ourselves in the way of people who have legislative power and getting together with people who, not just like-minded people who are obvious greenies or lefties or whatever, like getting together with people who are like farmers or like nurses or whatever and saying, you know, it affects everything I do for work, or it affects everything happening to my children, or it affects everything I used to love about this community that we're living in, our electorate. And actually going to them with something, you know, a range of people, you know, not just people who are the classic environmentalist type. So the less engaged with climate change you are, the more impactful it is when you're like, excuse me, local MP, I'm like really worried about climate change because of this. What are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? All the time, just like getting answers.
That's it, like the common ground. And I think like big shout out to Rebecca Huntley and her book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, because she does such an amazing job of tying that all in together and looking at the different emotions that we're obviously not all the same, even if we're the same generation or demographic or have come from similar back, you know, in the same career, whatever it may be. Like we're all very different people and will emotionally relate to things in a different way, but finding the common ground so that we're not just, you know, me at home firing off a letter to so-and-so or going to vote, but a whole kind of communities and collectives. And the other thing I think that was really a really cool story was the Albert Park Kinder in terms of talking to older generations, because the whole, they're Australia's first carbon neutral kinder, and they've since expanded to be a Sustainable Schools Alliance. But their whole motive is not just to have their school carbon neutral and solar panels on the school, but the idea is that in turn break that powers the community, but also the kids going home. These little kids and the kids then at the high schools that are part of this Sustainable Schools Alliance are not only going to then graduate and with this kind of education of climate change and sustainability and environmental awareness, but they take that home to their families and their families who are in the community, that when you look down and you see not many houses might have solar panels, then the families start that conversation around the dinner table. Those families are all connected to different workplaces. So like hearing that from, I think, your kids or your family is one way to like bridge that those conversations can actually happen quite naturally and easily. So that I think was for us, like a really big inspiring thing, like all schools should be doing.
Totally. Like, especially because, you know, the main reason it's like, this is one of the things, like there were so many mini campaigns that popped up along the creation of the podcast that we were like, oh, it'd be really great to just like have a campaign to get all public schools to like have solar all state, because it's a state issue. And essentially like a lot of private schools have the money up front to be able to do that, but a lot of public schools don't. And even if we could make that happen, it would just, that benefit, it benefits the whole community, it benefits everyone, it benefits the kids. You can write it into the curriculum as something they're learning about, and it future-proofs things. Like it is just in every way a great initiative, a great solution, and it would be so cool to see something like that happening. And so yeah, with Jenny at Albert Park Kinder, that idea is spreading from the kindy to the primary school to the high school, and now they're the alliance, and then that alliance, now they hold all of this knowledge about what the barriers might be that you'll come across, and so they can help other people to overcome those barriers quicker. And yeah, that's why we're so much stronger together, because being the only person or the first person that you know that's done something is just not really, it's not where a lot of humans are very comfortable.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that that you discover is that there's this thing called pester power, and that kids are actually great at pestering adults in their lives to be better humans in general. Like, that's not good manners. That doesn't go in that bin. What are these light bulbs? They're so good at that. And look up pester power if you're not familiar, because
oh my god, I'm so
it's huge. But you can have whole community level pester power. That's what I was thinking about when you're introducing that example. I've got a couple more questions coming in on the chat. I'll go to, well, Mark Spencer has asked a question that I will come to your question, but I might leave that to the end, Mark. Thank you for that question. Toby, who's on the Simpatico TV chat, is asking a question, which is curious about the partnership with Greenpeace. I can see there's being some specific costs and benefits to having a well-established international environmental NGO back the podcast. Do you mind sharing some of your thoughts and deliberations on the partnership?
Yeah, so we had this idea for a few months that we were like, we could make it independently. I mean, I work with Audiocraft, the agency who I work with, who are also a partner on this project, were with us right from the beginning, which was awesome. And we went through a variety of different thoughts of how to get it made and where to go with it and what to do with it. And Greenpeace were looking to launch a channel as well. So we sort of it was this really nice kind of connection where we literally did knock on the door and we're like, hey, we have this idea we want to make. We're kind of learning along the way. Are you interested? And it worked in this really nice sort of partnership with them where they supported us to make it and then also to share these 4 episodes of this podcast. But also kind of opened us up to a lot of the talent we'd found and ideas we'd had by ourselves, but they really did get us out of the weeds and into the bigger picture, straight up kind of helping us with that sort of bigger picture thinking and introducing us to some pretty fantastic experts who were within Greenpeace's network and also a few steps outside of it and other organizations like Climate Warriors, 350.org, all working. So it was very, very grateful to have been able to work with them.
And it's also really cool to think about audience when it comes to Greenpeace. They weren't thinking, oh, you want to talk to people who aren't already totally into this, like a lot of the people who are already following Greenpeace, or what was their kind of take on audience?
I think that there's a lot of people who they already know a lot, but they haven't necessarily taken action. And because this is kind of almost campaign as podcast, not that I've seen that happen much before, but it's like every episode has an action tied into it. It's all culminating in an action. It was kind of a good way of helping people through, it's entertaining. It's just an entertaining podcast. But then through that, being able to take an action and giving people the resources to be able to make those decisions and make those calls and use those resources. It's really difficult to just send off a random email and get people to change their super and stuff like that. So I think that, the podcast was good at making things a lot more familiar and going a bit more into the depth of it and making particularly the things that are just financial stuff. For example, in episode 3, it was they just don't make you feel light and friendly and happy, and you just don't want to engage, but they don't feel familiar. And then by the end of the episode, those ideas are much more familiar to you. You're more likely to demystify a little bit and feel a bit more empowered to act. And that was kind of, so the Greenpeace audience, I don't think we have fully fledged numbers yet on how much that translated into actual action or how many people were I've already done all these things. But I still think it's interesting even if you know a lot,
and they trusted us a lot, I think, to be the ones, the blabbering mouths, kind of funneling these what we learned out into the world through ultimately a Greenpeace channel. But I think that worked really well because it was something that we valued as well at the beginning, right at the beginning of this search. Was part of the thing that comes into, I think, the overwhelm is there are so many different people saying so many different things all the time that you're I'm going to listen to my friend because they're and I know they're not trying to sell me anything or push anything. And I think it kind of made Ash and I be able to hold on to some of that. We are just trying to be as honest of what we learned, and we can look like idiots. And if we do, it's on us, not on Greenpeace.
Totally. Yeah. And Greenpeace doesn't have any allegiances to any brands. They don't take any money from anyone except for supporters. So it's only supporters. They don't have any sort of political affiliations and stuff. So it's just a really fortunate, delightful connection. It just makes a lot of sense. and it's not got the same tone as as some other Greenpeace campaigns. I know you were saying like the website's so fun. I think that some of the emails that went out to their usual kind of like subscribers, like the people who have been with Greenpeace for a while, like maybe since, I don't know, like the 70s, there were like lots of people being like, it's the best thing, oh my gosh, and the other people being like, I don't get it. And I think that, you know, there's the old guard still who might not have found it as applicable.
And I think that's the thing, you know, you're both very strategic communicators, but when you think about why certain people may not connect with this, it can be people at the different ends of the spectrum, either because it doesn't matter what you say or do, they're not going to be on board, or because they've already been on board for so long that this isn't their thing, and it's okay if your audience is something else. In fact, maybe it's awesome. I just want to show everyone the website here, greenpeace.org.au/heapsbetter, because I've already taken up so much of your time, but we are at the end of our time here. I just wanted to let everyone know to check it out. It is a great one. I'm only halfway through, but it's a great one to listen to, I think, as we head into a new year, same climate. Let's just be a different us, I think. And I found it really empowering, even if there you both are, cute. You can donate too. So even if you are someone who feels like you've been involved in the chat and the actions and all these things, I think you can learn something from this. If you're someone who's a climate communicator, you might learn about different ways of communicating about this and different ways to present the talk about some of these things, which is something I got out of it as well. And even I've talked to climate scientists this year who have felt like they don't know what to do because their science is not the problem or solution potentially. So regardless of who you are, whether you're just climate curious, climate concerned, unsure what to think or do, or you're someone who's been here, like, get amongst it. 4 episodes. Lovely. Do you want to...
And climate's a part of life now, you know. It's not going to be kind of like, oh, there's climate science over here and then there's all of the other issues. It's just going to be like just this big cloud of climate over everyone's life. So you need a very wide range of voices coming together, and you need those voices to be sort of like not just talking about climate as like a thing that's happening over there, but as in everyone's life, and how we can live well right now and how we can go in a great direction. And, you know, that's at least how I feel, because it's here. You know,
it is.
Yeah.
It's not abstract. It's more tangible than ever, unfortunately. But that can lead to a lot of action. And I think I just wanted to give you both an opportunity before we go to answer this question from Mark that I mentioned earlier. Earlier, Mark said game not only recognised game, but he feels that Heaps Better is changing or has already changed the game as far as climate podcasting in Australia. And then he says, you know, if this is Australia's climate podcasting serial moment, as in the serial podcast, what do you want to see next?
Ooh, in terms of like a season from Heaps Better or something?
Whatever.
Okay, so just a dream in my mind is that because we're looking at, you know, Greenpeace is looking at rebuilding better out of COVID. That was kind of like the thing that a lot of people were like, how do we, you know, rebuild green? There's lots of things that are sort of like time-based now that it would be really interesting to sort of like talk about and push forward in real time. Whether or not that's possible is a totally different thing. But I just think that kind of like, there's this great moment with Annie Leonard from Greenpeace US at the end. She also does a story of stuff. And she was talking about how this moment with COVID and Black Lives Matter and climate change is this not like we're just going to be going into different little silos and not interacting. Like all of these things are coming together, and sometimes a solution to one of them is a solution to many of them at the same time. So, I guess we're getting more integrated in our approach to just like improving the planet and human experience, you know, and the trajectory that we're on. So yeah, that stuff's really interesting, seeing how it all fits together.
Yeah, totally agree. I think all the conversations around climate justice and social justice tying into not just ditching fossil fuels, and How to Save a Planet did such a fantastic episode on Black Lives Matter and the climate movement, which I 100% recommend listening as a starting point. And then there's just so much to learn, and so much that I think just in all aspects of our lives 2020 has taught us to learn. But that I think definitely feels like would be the next thing.
Yeah, and I think the other one to give a shout out to would be All We Can Save. That is one made by Gimlet Media, I think, or at least with them involved out of the States.
Yeah, so that's Ayanna Elizabeth Taylor's book. Ayanna Elizabeth Taylor?
Yeah.
Who am I thinking of? Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Yeah, that's her. That's the kind of book. Oh man, there was a really interesting episode of How to Save a Planet that had like an audio episode about, you know, selling property in Miami and what people are saying about what's going to happen there when they sell property to people. And it's just crazy. It's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we are already having a conversation about in Australia, and definitely there are so many people in Australia who've been talking about not just climate action but climate justice for a long time, and what that means for recognising Indigenous Australians and their ownership and custodianship,
totally.
As well as, you know, putting marginalised people at the forefront of this, so we don't just have climate action, but that those actions are actually actions that make things heaps better for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Awesome. And not just making it heaps better for everyone, because we are heaps better together. Like it's so clear to us now after doing the podcast that, like, you know, part of the grievance that we have, or a lot of the grievance that we have with climate action, is that we feel very alone, very confronted, very helpless, very overwhelmed. And so when we come together socially and we have interesting solutions, and we see other people working and we're seeing action happen, and then we can replicate action ourselves, we're in a much more relaxed place and a much more connected place. And, you know, obviously there's the numbers game of, you know, hitting certain tipping points and getting to the point where like you reach a critical mass, and then things really take off in a good direction, and you can't turn back anymore, and it becomes just like normal to do things a better way, right? So, you know, we're heaps better together numerically, but also just like spiritually, holistically, in every way, we're heaps better together. And that's kind of, you know, what we kind of hope the podcast can do for people, is make them feel like they're part of that thing that's happening. Because it is happening. It's happening all over the time.
Love it. Thank you both so much for joining me today, and I hope everyone watching will check it out. I've really enjoyed listening to it. I'm looking forward to listening to the final episodes. Now the final one is out too. And also, I just wanted to say that you can find Climate Australia again next year. I'll be streaming here on Facebook, on YouTube, if you look up Constable, and also within the home of Climate Australia, which is Simpatico TV. So
congrats on finishing your season. Final stream.
Thank you both so much, and we'll catch you another time, I'm sure.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you everyone who's tuned in as well.
Thanks very much. Awesome. That was Ash and Jess from the Heaps Better podcast team, supported by Greenpeace Australia. And of course, we are talking about not just climate change or climate crisis, but climate action and collective impact, which is great. A great way to end off the year. I just want to, before I go, thank everyone at Simpatico TV. Firstly, thank you to our guests, of course, and of course to Greenpeace Australia too, but thank you to Simpatico. Thank you to Ken, Sarah, Lisa, Mike, Fahim, Islamul, Shabnam. Thank you to also Megan, who is often BTS, usually BTS here, and stream inspectors as well. Thank you to Zach. Thank you to Ruhama. Thank you to Sakib, although I'm just opening up the team because I just want to thank everyone. I also want to thank everyone who's come along and watched. Thank you to everyone who's shared. Thank you, Fatima, as well. It is a public holiday where you are, but hi and thank you. Thank you to everyone in the team because it has been awesome, and also thank you to Climactic for supporting us, and you'll be seeing more from Mark and Climactic in the new year on Climate Australia and elsewhere, and also seeing Climate Australia in the new year as one of the Climactic podcasts, so you'll actually have the audio for this as a podcast. And I'm just going to chuck up some credits here, but I just want to thank all the guests, and I hope you all have a safe entrance into 2021 wherever you are in the world. Look after yourself, look after each other. Remember, you have to look after yourself to look after the planet, and remember that it's only going to be through a full cup that we can pour. You can't pour from an empty cup. So wherever you are, look after your mental health, because that can sometimes be the first step to being able to look after the climate. So thanks again, and I'll see you another time. But for now, here are my beautiful credits from our wonderful team.